I'm Greg Sandow, and I'm sitting here with somebody who is completely unabashed about saying that he is not part of the orchestra world.
That's for sure.
And has no compunction about talking about other things, which in fact is the reason we brought him here. This is Ralph Locke. He is professor of musicology at the Eastman School of Music. And Ralph, we have, as we just worked out 5 minutes ago, 2 agenda items. One of them is the work you've done translating some material by Franz Liszt from way back in his time in the 19th century that seems oddly prophetic of where we are now. And then, which I have to admit was my idea, but you're happy to talk about it, right?
Right.
The rather extraordinary paper you wrote on what I might call the social responsibility of a musicologist, how a musicologist can make some difference in the world outside scholarship.
Right. Happy to talk about both of those.
Great. So starting with item 1, tell us about what you found out about Liszt.
Well, I was asked by the organizers of the Bard Festival to translate an essay by Liszt that Liszt wrote in 1835 when he was 23, one of his first published essays that had never been published before. It's never been translated before. It had been published in the original French. He was living in Paris, and he wrote this long essay. It was so long that it was published in 6 installments, and then there was an addendum as well. So there are really 7 installments, none of which has ever been translated in full. And there were doubts about its authorship because Liszt did get some help on some of his later writings from his first mistress, Marie Dagout, and then on the later ones from his second mistress.
You know, parenthetically,
yes.
If we're going to talk about composers having help with their published writings, we might mention the name Stravinsky, who never really committed a note to paper under his name without having somebody else.
Word to paper.
Yes,
right.
Word to paper, exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And it's very similar there.
Yes. Did I say notes to paper?
Yeah, right.
I guess I did. Well, those he did by himself.
Right.
We know that.
No, that's true with Stravinsky, the autobiography, the poetics,
exactly.
And all those.
So Liszt is in good company here if he did have some help.
Absolutely. But there's an autograph did show up, and it's in the British Library now, and it's in his own hand with his crossouts where he changed his ideas about what word he wanted to use, and that's the 6th installment, what he intended to be the final installment, though there was then finally an addendum as well, and where he sums up all of his ideas and his specific recommendations, and because that exists in his own hand, the editors of this book that was published for the Bard Festival, Liszt in His World. And
just take a moment on the Bard Festival. I'll just fill this in. For those who don't know about it, this takes place every summer at Bard University, north of New York City, along the Hudson River. Leon Botstein, the president of the festival and also the music director of the American Symphony Orchestra, organizes a festival always about one composer. The depth that is gone into in panel discussions and concerts could be extraordinary. And one of the results is always a book of stimulating essays on the composer. So you happen to have been asked to take part the summer they did Liszt.
Which was 2 summers ago.
Yeah.
2006. And I was delighted to translate this essay from the French and to write a commentary on it as well. And to think briefly also about the ways in which this echoes resonates for us today. Because it might be interesting for me to read the 8 postulates or 8 recommendations that Liszt made at age 23 in 1835. He said there should be a competition every 5 years for works in the major musical genres. He said that these new works would therefore form a new musical museum, as if they were hanging on a wall. Second, he wanted there to be music education in the schools. I think this is interesting because, of course, the question of funding music education in the schools is very problematic right now. Been a lot of cuts for music and arts. Third, reform of church music, and of course there have been lots of battles about what kind of music is appropriate for church through the years. 4 state-sponsored festivals of symphonic music, so some of the great works could get adequate performances. In a sense, we can think of that as being analogous to government support for symphony orchestras. Active encouragement of opera recitals and chamber music. We wouldn't expect this from Liszt necessarily. We think of him as a performing virtuoso, and he also was an active conductor in Germany in the 1850s. But we don't think of him as a chamber musician or as being much involved in opera, but that was very important to him too. 6, this is interesting to me, maybe as a member of the Eastman School faculty, a new and different music school. A different kind of music school. And if you want to know what he had in mind, he specifically recommends courses in music history and aesthetics. He feels that musicians need to be broadly educated, in other words, not just trained in flexible fingers and so on. And then finally, inexpensive editions of the greatest musical works of the past. He wanted students to be able to have access to copies of the music themselves so they can study and mark them up. And he says, again, very flattering for musicologists, scholarly studies and dissertations that explore and explain the masterworks. So Liszt definitely wanted some of us around.
Some of this appears surprising, at least to me, from what may be a superficial knowledge of the period. Why, for example, would Liszt be calling for competitions for composers when I think our perception is that back then new music was far more a general part of the music scene than it is now? It was not often a corner by itself, but Liszt was to go on to have a thriving career as a composer. And for Liszt, for Schumann, for Verdi, for Donizetti, for endless 19th century composers we could name, for Wagner, being a composer did not appear to be a problematic thing. So why did he want competitions to further what I might think was already happening? He must have had something in mind.
Well, he did, and he specifically said that what is expected of a composer and a performing musician in society is often superficial music. He complained that many musicians were making dance music in dance halls for the middle class, the working public, and so on. And the aristocrats wanted a notable virtuoso to come into the house, usually through the servants' entrance, and then to perform lively tunes, touching ballads, and so on, but nothing very musically demanding.
And he would know, wouldn't he? Because
yes.
He was doing that.
Yes, and he complained about that. Yes. He complained that he was only people wanted him to play dance music and the latest opera comique tune and do fancy variations on it and so on.
Funny thing, he wrote all those fantasies on operatic hits of the day, so he obliged.
Oh, definitely, and he did them extremely well.
Yes.
We have to say that if that's the kind of music that the superficial aristocrats wanted to hear, he at least did it in an amazing fashion.
So it seems to me underlying every one of these points is the idea that he wanted the music world to be more serious than it was.
Right. He specifically said, I come to people's homes, and the merest bagatelle is received with salvos of applause, whereas a masterpiece by Beethoven or Schubert is met with awkward silence. And people don't know what to make of it. He wants people. He wants to raise the level of listeners to a level of discernment where they can really appreciate the great works.
And he wants the great works to be more disseminated. He wants people to be able to buy them, and not just music students, but I imagine anybody.
Absolutely.
Take them home and play them, which did happen. That's one of his recommendations, I think, that managed to evolve. And then he wants there to be more serious study of music historically, which was certainly brand new.
For sure.
Back then. And explain how some of the other points fit in his time.
You raised the question about the competition. I think competition relates to that because he felt that the musical marketplace, as it existed at the time, was not adequate to encouraging serious composition. Berlioz felt that too. Berlioz actually has a very touching passage in the memoirs in which he recalls a time when he dreamed a symphony. And he woke up and realized, while it was still fresh in his mind, that if he made the mistake of copying it down, he would then have to and he calculated how much money it would cost him to hire the musicians and hire the copyists for the parts and so on. And he would have to actually go into debt. He would become bankrupt because of this latest symphony, and he decided to let it vanish.
So this is new to me. Berlioz suppressed not the works themselves, but even the desire to write some works, in spite of everything he did write that required extensive copying. All his orchestral music, Romeo and Juliet, the Symphonie Fantastique, Harold in Italy, he wrote them, but he might have written more, but he didn't want to. Now, I think this needs some explanation, because I might have been under the impression that this was a great period for serious musical composition, because of all the serious great composers who were active, but apparently not so much.
It was a struggle. It was absolutely a struggle. Every one of the great composers that we can think of had some other way of making a living. And it's important to remember that the situation now is maybe not so different from the situation then. Chopin taught the daughters of the aristocracy how to play piano. A number of them were very good, too, but they were aristocrats, and aristocratic ladies were not permitted to hold jobs and therefore play music publicly, so they didn't. So we don't hear about Chopin's students, but he had students. And a number of the composers were writers and were music critics, so Schumann and Berlioz and Weber and Wagner, a number of them made a lot of their money by writing, especially early in their career. Some of them were conductors, of course, as well. Wagner and Mendelssohn and Berlioz with his own work.
So one conclusion we can draw, not just from this point, but from some of the others, is that the highest, greatest levels of taste are never going to be a given. Not then, not now.
Yeah.
How does that play into some of the other points? I would need even to remind myself what they are. Okay, music education in the schools. Somebody now might say, well, I don't know if they learned it in the schools, but surely almost everybody played the piano. Many people played stringed instruments. People walked about the streets of Vienna, or so I've read, looking for string quartet partners. So why would he be insisting on music education if there was a general level of music literacy?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much Liszt had thought through that point, but he did have a point in mentioning it, which is that music in the schools could encourage group singing. And group singing is a kind of civic activity. So he was thinking of music in a very particular way. This is a way of inculcating certain kinds of group values. It encourages people. If you make music together, you're respecting each other, you're learning how to work together. And he understood some things that people in the music education business now talk about also, that a student who's in a band, or middle school band or high school chorus, learns a certain kind of teamwork and how to excel and show discipline to a task, and at the same time how to hold back on the ego enough to blend with others, and when to stand out, when to back off, all of those skills.
And you even have some people taking this into the corporate world and using orchestral life as a demonstration of how people can work together. So this point about music education, it's good you explained it. It doesn't mean what we might think it means.
It had a larger significance for Liszt, and that's why he's also concerned with religious music also. He's very concerned with what are the ways in which music can help people build a sense of community.
And probably the best music. He wants them singing and playing music that fits his concept, which is probably not too different from our own, about what the proper aesthetic level of music is. But then when he talks about state-sponsored festivals of symphonic music, why would those have been necessary? Again, it would seem perhaps that with so many composers who we now revere writing symphonic works, that there must have been performances of them.
A lot of pieces that we know very well were actually not performed that much at the time. People might have encountered them through piano four-hand arrangements, for example, but adequate symphonic realization and adequate performance of choral and orchestral works was relatively rare. The chance to hear the Beethoven Ninth, for example. Habeneck, the great Beethoven conductor in France in the 1820s and 30s, rehearsed the Ninth Symphony for several years, performing one movement at a time each year and then finally putting it all together. A little bit the way we do the ring cycle of Wagner.
And this was after Liszt wrote this, a few years after, or about the same time?
Around the same time, yeah.
Because at that time, it seems maybe strange to us because Beethoven was already dead and quite revered. But yet his symphonies were not everyday concert staples at all. And when Habeneck started those concerts in Paris, where the symphonies were done regularly, it was a revelation to people.
Yeah, it was also a revelation to Wagner when he came to Paris, because he said those performances were actually better than the Beethoven performances that he could hear back in Germany. And that's a nice reminder to us that the level of orchestral performance that we have come to expect. We live in an age now of remarkably high standards of orchestral performance. There was nothing like that in the 19th century.
No, and I know from some of the reading I've done, particularly from William Weber, who has studied the history and, in a sense, the sociology of performance then, that a lot of the players playing serious symphonic repertoire were amateurs, as compared to the professionals who would be playing in the opera pits, or maybe playing for Johann Strauss Sr. in Vienna, playing commercial waltzes.
Right. They also had very few rehearsals for these works, and often they were permitted to send someone in their place to the rehearsal, so that the orchestra member who actually played the performance had not been at the rehearsals. He had sent his student or something, and because he got a better paying job playing dance music at some wealthy home.
Which he actually had to take in order to make a living. So it's not completely irresponsible.
No.
So then, given that, now what you have is a scene here where opera was maybe the most popular art form, and Rossini, the most popular composer in Europe. I mean, the most popular musical art form, opera. And people playing opera excerpts on the piano at home and singing opera arias. Why then, if Liszt wants symphonic music encouraged, does he also want opera encouraged? One would have thought that opera was a smash commercial success then.
Yeah, that's interesting. It may be that he put opera in there just to make his plan complete. He doesn't talk much about the problems of opera elsewhere, except it's clear that there were also important operas that he thought weren't performed as often and at the level that they should be. And we have to remember that the great works of Mozart, for example, were often carved up, and the musical numbers were put to totally different librettos and with different words. This happened with Weber's Der Freischütz also, where Castile Blas, the Paris music critic, wrote a whole new libretto for it about Robin Hood, and Berlioz was furious about it and complained.
And then we can remember Berlioz's book Evenings with the Orchestra, which is cast in the form of imaginary conversations between orchestra musicians while they play crap in the opera house. But then he'll have a chapter where it simply says Mozart's Don Giovanni is played, no one says a word.
They're too busy making music and paying attention.
So maybe Liszt wanted encouragement of the best.
I think
operas.
So. That's definitely part of it.
So, isn't this fascinating? Things were not as different as we would expect.
Although it is interesting that the question of standards of orchestral playing, there can be no doubt that we are living in just a remarkable age in that
people
regard.
Would have just fallen over dead with shock if they heard the way we played now. But maybe, though, there was more of a sense of surprise then.
That wouldn't surprise me. We read lots of descriptions of how responsive the audience was to music, that they would even gasp or even applaud in the middle of a movement when something happened unexpected. When Berlioz talks about this, the music makes in Mozart or in his own Requiem makes a surprising modulation, and people would go, ah. And of course, we would be horrified. We wouldn't dare do that now.
Liszt doesn't need to talk about because he would take for granted that this would occur. I remember also something I just recently read. Beethoven's Fifth is being performed in Germany. The equivalent of the Paris Conservatoire concerts. It's now a piece that gets performed a bunch, and people are used to going and hearing it. But even so, in the last movement, the passage with the rapidly descending scales in the violin, this account talks about the violinists and the audience making eye contact, all knowing that they were hearing something extraordinary that they weren't used to. But now comes the interesting question. That was a wonderfully lively part of the music world, which doesn't exist anymore. To what extent, now, saying something a little speculative, to what extent does Liszt's emphasis on being very, very serious here work in the long run against that kind of spontaneity, while, of course, encouraging other worthwhile values?
I think there is a problem, and you've written about this, and a lot of us have been very kind of intrigued to discuss how we can shake up a little bit the all too settled world of concert music in America, where concerts have become, and maybe in Europe too, where concerts have become so routinized and audience behavior is so appropriate and restrained and so on, that there isn't a sense of involvement. I wonder whether maybe some of this back then, people in a certain city had much more of a connection with members of an orchestra. They would know that the flutist or the first hornist and so on, and have an idea of that particular sound that person could make. There was certainly a much more distinctive local tradition of music making back then, and that continued into Europe in the 20th century.
I think orchestras now are to some extent trying to bring this back by putting the musicians more in front of the public. The simple way to do it is devote a couple of pages of the program book to a profile of individual musicians, but they can come out on stage and speak. I have seen situations sometimes where people in the audience will go up to the stage before the concert starts and talk to musicians they know, which is lovely. But this, I think, what you have translated for us all here, and what we're talking about, is a turning point in the way music is understood, taught, fostered, and performed. A turning point towards seriousness, which has the virtue of leading to better performances and more frequent performances of more serious repertoire, but at the loss of a certain amount of spontaneity. Which is probably something we're still wrestling with. You know, one thing I've read is that at those Paris Conservatoire concerts, which again should say this is not dead history. This is one of the places where Beethoven's symphonies began to come into the repertoire to hold the place that they hold now. Didn't happen automatically just once they were first performed. So it became routine at the transition from the third movement of the Fifth Symphony into the finale. When the finale burst forth like a sunburst, people would applaud. Do you think Liszt liked that? Or was that something that Liszt would have thought people should be educated to suppress?
It's interesting. Liszt had both of those tendencies in himself. He was obviously a showman. And in his early years when he did play Beethoven sonatas, for example, he would sometimes exaggerate effects and be very flamboyant in his performance. And then he began to become more restrained as he maybe felt that people were beginning to take this seriously and he didn't have to try to sell it or oversell it. But in the process, he was beginning this process of classicization that you're saying. That making...
or Joseph Horowitz likes to use the word sacralization, which I think is a good term, making it almost a sacred right.
Yeah, it is interesting to see nowadays when occasionally a conductor does something a little extreme, or a soloist. We have people, a conductor like Sinopoli, for example, or a pianist like Lang Lang. there are people who say, "Whoa, that's too fast, too slow. You can't do that." Right? And other people say, "Whoa, that was different. That was fun. That was interesting." And some people who would not be interested at all say, "Oh, classical music. I kind of like that. If that's classical music, I like it."
Well, something that comes to my mind is an extraordinary statement by Brahms that I came across in one of Robert Phillips' books about the early days of recording and how the advent of recording affected classical performance. I can't remember the context in which he brings it up, but Joachim, we mean Joseph Joachim, the great violinist and Brahms's friend, was going to conduct a performance of the Fourth Symphony when it was still very new. So he writes to Brahms and he says, "Tell me the tempi for each movement." And Brahms writes back with the metronome markings and says, "But these are not the tempi I would want you to take when you know the piece better. But while you, the orchestra, and the audience don't know it, Brahms felt that all the contrasts in the piece should be exaggerated so that people who didn't know it could follow it better."
Oh, how interesting. That's a wonderful quote. I should see that. That is interesting, which is actually just what Liszt had done with the Beethoven sonatas early on.
And then pulled back from. Although I've read an account of Liszt playing in this second phase of his, the Moonlight Sonata, and although he added no embellishments as he had earlier and played it extremely seriously, he also had all the lights turned out. So now there was a theatrical staging of it, even though the music itself was done in the most serious fashion. So the showman was not extinct.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure. I think that Liszt at his most sober must have been a gripping performer. There's no question. I would have loved to be able to hear one of those concerts.
You know, that is so true. And it's built into his piano music. It's very easy to say from a very high church point of view, "Oh my God, the B minor sonata, it's so repetitious. He will simply repeat phrases in a slightly different key." And then you realize the point of it is to have it played so you're always on the edge of the seat. And that's why it's written the way it is.
Right.
So it's like Elvis singing, but it's Liszt playing.
That's great.
So this is an interesting demonstration, Ralph, of how, at least to me, musicology is not the dry as dust study that people sometimes think it is.
For sure.
And how it unearths red meat, things that are really distinctly relevant to our situation now.
Yeah, I was struck by the fact that early on in the essay, he says the single biggest problem for people in the arts is that they are isolated, and including isolated from each other, so that musicians don't band together to try to solve their common problems, and musicians don't know what poets do and don't know what visual artists do, and so on. And that's certainly an ongoing problem. Obviously, some of that has been solved through unions and so on.
You know, I was just thinking of unions, considering that we have presumably an audience largely of orchestra musicians for what we're talking about here. These are people who have banded together to solve their problems. There's no doubt about that.
But often performing musicians, and I know from working at Eastman, don't have regular contact with people in the other arts or in literature. And we know, though, that concerts can often be very enlivened by bringing in dancers or video and so on, and there are attempts to do that now. Musicians often don't know even where to turn. They don't know a poet that they could say, "Would you write some poems and declaim them from stage before I play this piece?" Because we musicians live in our own little world.
It's true, and since I teach at Juilliard, I can see this regularly. Juilliard, after all, has not only music, but it has a drama division and a dance division, and also a very serious jazz program. But these four things don't mingle. I have occasionally had a jazz student in one of my classes, but the educational programs are distinct. Interdisciplinary work is rare. The administration would love it to happen, but there's no real way that it can, considering that everybody's focused on their own education. And God knows, I would be delighted, but quite surprised if the New York Philharmonic should premiere a new piece, and suddenly we see the hall full of painters and poets and playwrights and literary critics. It just doesn't happen.
Well, it is bound to happen more as I think people are beginning to experiment with the concert format. And here at the Eastman School, there's a women's music festival now that happens in the spring, and they intentionally do poetry readings in between the musical numbers, and it's very interesting often how the resonances will go between the literature and the music.
But you wrote for a rather extraordinary volume called Rethinking Music, an essay on how musicologists can actually use their work to affect the outside world. The book is a collection of essays rethinking many things about classical music and how it fits in the world at large and how we think about it. Your essay was rethinking the role of the musicologist. Not simply is somebody going to discover how to read medieval manuscripts or which note to begin a trill on or exactly how instruments of the past were built and how many of them were in the orchestra. You're actually going to make a difference to the lives of people maybe who don't have anything to do with music at all.
Well, one of the points that I wanted to make, first of all, is that musicologists are often conveying social messages in the course of their work without even maybe realizing it. And I was trying to encourage musicologists to be a little bit more overt or transparent about what their motivations are, what their values are, what their premises are, because often, for example, what we're trying to show is that Italian music in the 19th century was more varied than people give it credit for. Or
you mean not all just opera?
Not all just opera. Or often people are trying to show that works that are seem very difficult and complex are actually ones that people can understand if they just pay attention and so on. So there's a kind of message there about the ability of regular people to deal with masterpieces.
It's a very big issue now.
Absolutely,
because
yes.
The classical music field feels that it has to open itself up to a wider audience, probably because the audience it has is perceived to be shrinking. Given this, how do you do that? Some people would say, but there's a big obstacle. The pieces cannot be understood unless you have some education in their structure and history. And a musicologist who heavily emphasized the structure and history of a piece might be contributing to that sense. Whereas other people might say, no, just take down the walls, make the performances a little bit more informal, and the music will speak for itself. And maybe a musicologist, well, tell me how a musicologist might support that point of view in his or her work.
One of the points that I know I often try to do is to figure out what the likely meanings that a work had for people at the time. And you can sometimes find this by looking at reviews of early performances. For example, Verdi's Aida was a work that was a case of a work that was enormously popular early on. So it doesn't have the complexity issue in a sense. But the question of what did it mean at the time, if you read the review of the very first performance in Cairo, there were two European critics who were there, and one of them specifically talked about the bizarre sound of the long trumpets doing bom, 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 bom,
in the famous march.
In the famous march,
in the
right?
Second act.
And he was. This to us sounds. We're so familiar with it that it seems perhaps a bit safe and predictable and so on. But to him, it was like the strangest thing. Maybe because they weren't the regular trumpets, or also because the trumpets were playing the natural overtone series to a large extent, so that there's only a limited number of pitches that the trumpets can play. And that makes us realize that some of this music sounded more challenging in a way, and more surprising than we might expect.
More dramatic.
More dramatic,
in the very simple sense. I don't mean opera as drama expressed through music. I simply mean, my God, listen to that when it happened.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And I think that may be far more true than we now understand with many, many works in the repertoire.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. If you listen to early performances of Debussy, for example, the people like George Copeland was one of the pianists who first brought his piano works to the United States. They may not have quite the level of technical sheen that we expect, but there's a kind of poetry there. Obviously, people early on heard something magical, and there's a certain aura to the piece that I think listeners must have caught on to very soon.
Yeah, because one thing they had back then that we can't recapture very easily is they didn't know it. They didn't know the music. They didn't know what they were going to hear. They couldn't say, oh, Debussy, so lovely that he doesn't develop his themes, he just juxtaposes. It's so lovely that the harmonies shift. But then I think people were saying, what's happening here? I feel adrift. And for some people, that might have been a tremendously pleasurable experience, and for others, very disconcerting.
Right. The question about what musicologists, that other article you were talking about, what musicologists can do, one thought that occurs to me is that a number of musicologists have been very involved in digging up works of women composers. I was just talking about the Women's Music Festival here, and that whole question of kind of shining a light into the dark corners of music history is very important. There have been many scholars who have discovered important composers. One of the most significant is Fanny Hensel, who is Felix Mendelssohn's sister, who was enormously talented and wrote some of those beautiful piano pieces and songs in the whole 19th century. And this body of work is now available. It's quite wonderful to hear it. And in the scholars who are involved in this are essentially carrying out certain social ideals, which is to draw attention to women of talent, encourage women today, and it seems to me that's a wonderful role that scholars can play.
Well, it is, and I think it really speaks to the position of classical music in society today and why more people don't take an interest in it. Now, I'm sure that there are some people who are hearing this and they're rolling their eyes a little bit and they're saying, oh God, here we go. Political correctness. We have to trot out all these women composers whether they're good or not. But the other side of that coin, which to me is much more important, is that for many people looking at classical music from the outside, nothing at all is going on. You know, the orchestra plays this week, and it's a bunch of dead white men. And, you know, the music is great. But the week after, it's another group of these marble busts in the museum. And to people from the outside, they can't see the difference. But if you say to them, you know what? There were some extraordinary women writing music in the 19th century, and that work was just forgotten. You don't even have to use a word like suppressed, simply forgotten. People could take an interest in that because people are interested in the status of women now. So I think that really can make a connection in the minds of people who don't normally take an interest in classical music. And it also should not be surprising. This has nothing to do with political correctness. This is simply history. We understand perfectly well that women in the 19th century didn't have the opportunities that women have today. Everybody knows this. Women in the 1950s didn't have the opportunities that women had today. And so there could have been people writing music easily who would not get the support and attention a man would get. That's elementary.
It's also true that because of the sifting process, there's a lot of wonderful music from the 19th century in general that we don't play very much. And some of it's by men and some of it's by women. Some people are interested in reviving, actually at the Bard Festival, for example, they're often performing pieces that have gotten lost along the way by English composers and by the kind of second-rank German composers, and these are well worth listening to.
Which often shed light, of course, on the composers we call the great composers, because we see the context they came after. Now, that might be a little scholarly for people who don't go to classical concerts often, or maybe not. People go to museum shows to see things like that. So they conceivably might come to concerts. What else do you think a musicologist could do? And I'm going to really put you on the spot by saying, if we're all going to try to make classical music thrive more, what can a musicologist do?
It seems to me that for a lot of people who don't know classical music and don't know why they should care, part of it is that they don't have any sense of where this music came from. And musicologists obviously do know a lot about history and context, cultural context, and so on. So we do certainly have many ways in which we can convey some of what makes this music exciting, what kind of worldview it reflects, how it relates to painting at the same time, and political developments and so on. So that's what a number of us try to do in various ways in our work.
Do you think it leads to any consequences for the way the music is performed?
I think it might, and certainly the Eastman students I've talked to, some of them do lecture recitals, for example. These are DMA students on an instrument. They often get very interested in this, and then they do a pianist may do a recital on Debussy's piano music, for example, and the paintings of the time. There are a lot of interesting writings about, was Debussy closer to the Impressionists in painting or closer to the Symbolists in literature, and so on. And students get very involved in that and try to kind of puzzle out, well, what's the difference between those two aesthetic orientations? And then they find a way to present that to an audience. And they often find that they may play the piece a little bit differently.
How? How might they play it differently? That really, I think, is getting down to bedrock here.
Yeah. Well, one of the traditions that I've heard about from French pianists of Debussy is to play with a lot less pedal than we're accustomed to thinking of for Debussy. And I know people who studied with Yvonne Loriot, for example, Messiaen's wife. And that raises very interesting questions because, of course, Impressionist painting, although we may think of it as blurry and so on, as if you look at the brushwork and so on,
it's very precise.
It says very precise. Yes. It's more kind of juxtaposition of very discrete colors jutting against each other.
And I think when you're hearing somebody play Debussy in this way, even if you're not familiar with the issues, you're not a Debussy expert, maybe you don't go to classical concerts hardly at all, and so you don't jump up and say, my God, she's not using pedal. But you do sense the commitment that the performer is bringing to it, having found something of their own to bring to it, some new understanding that they have that maybe other people don't have in the same way.
Yeah.
I thought also of your example of Aida. You're staging the Triumphal March, and it's easy now to take the trumpets for granted. First of all, I bet very often they're done on orchestral trumpets, which aren't the natural trumpets. Even though we know that Verdi went to great lengths to have them built precisely to his specifications so that they would sound really unusual. So it might suggest another way to stage the scene so the trumpets got a lot of prominence. And even if they were being played in the orchestra, maybe the dancers or whoever who walk across the stage pretending to play them could do it with a great deal of panache, understanding that Verdi meant something very extraordinary to be happening in music that now you could say is so hackneyed, everybody who goes to the opera knows it by heart. But knowing the impression it made then, there are so many ways you can try to bring that back.
I sometimes feel like I'd love almost anything to be tried that could make the opera-going experience, the concert-going experience fresher.
Now, what's the craziest thing you can think of?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. One of the craziest things I can think of is for people, because I deal with Eastman students all the time, for them to listen to early 20th century recordings, of which we have many, and notice how differently music was played back then the way it is now, and to see whether they might want to try some of those things. I'm not saying imitate exactly.
For example, what?
I've actually regularly exposed the undergraduates in my classical romantic survey course to performances of Chopin by Joseph Hoffman and Sergei Rachmaninoff. These are recordings from the 1920s and 30s, and they slow down and they speed up, and it says play pianissimo and they play fortissimo, and they obviously feel they own this music. They're probably not even looking at the score anymore because they memorized it when they were 11. So in a certain sense, they feel that they embody the tradition, and then they can play the music however they feel at the moment. So that all of those decisions that they make, whether they're spontaneous or whether that's the way they've been playing it for years, go so contrary to the indications of the score that the students, I think, would get into a lot of trouble, probably if they went to a piano competition and tried to play that way. So if you say what would be extreme is to try to play now the way people used to play 80 or 90 years ago.
That is remarkably true, and it certainly holds for orchestral playing. There's a famous recording of the Beethoven Violin Concerto. I think Fritz Kreisler is the violinist and Bruno Walter is the conductor. And in the orchestral introduction to the first movement, the tempo changes constantly as Walter comes to a phrase, and he'll say, in effect, I think this one should feel like this. Which is actually Wagner's recommendations back in the 19th century in his day about how Beethoven should be conducted. Now, for a Beethoven orchestra performance in Beethoven's time to be played like that, it's probably not possible because they had hardly any rehearsal and they weren't used to it. For Beethoven to play his piano music like that, very likely from everything we know he did. And so it doesn't become inappropriate then to play the orchestral music like that. And recently, Mikhail Pletnev released a set of the Beethoven symphonies with the Russian National Orchestra in which he does do this.
I want to hear those.
The first movement of the Eroica, for example, is full of different tempi, which an unsympathetic hearer will say it's a distortion of the piece, a violation of everything Liszt was trying to accomplish. Somebody sympathetic will say, but it gives every passage such a distinct character that you can't wait to hear what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
But I think the key to it is just what you said. People have the chance to make music their own. And an audience is not going to react to that. Of course an audience is going to do that. So, Ralph, you're a subversive.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.